on how we might explain the persistence of authoritarian government in Russia and the Soviet Union, and we're hoping to cover the years between the 1850s and the present day, I suppose. We have Mark from Berlin online, and we also have David Lewis and his school from West London. David, do you want to introduce your students and start us off?
Okay. Well, my name's David Lewis. I'm Deputy Head Teacher at the Douai Martyrs School, also a history teacher. I just introduce some students here to my right. They can probably introduce themselves, actually. They're probably old enough. So here we are. Over to Beryl, first of all.
Hello, my name is Beryl.
Hi, Beryl.
I'm in year 13 and yeah, I'm studying history in Russia.
Good.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm in year 13 as well.
Okay. Would you like to ask a question and get the discussion going?
I could ask a question. Yeah? Shall I ask a question first?
Okay, but off you go.
Okay, so do you think that in the period of from the mid-19th century to the 1960s that Russia simply exchanged one form of authoritarianism for another?
Well, this is a very popular A-level question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm sure your question's partly informed by the need to find a way of answering that. I've thought about that, and it seems to me a slightly simplistic way of putting it. And my problem with it is that there's a sort of inbuilt teleology or sort of pattern that is supposed in the question, I think, which you might challenge. You might sort of ask, well, things might have turned out differently, and what factors would have had to have been in play for that to happen. And I think even more, one could say that underlining that question is some sort of a sense of inevitability about what happened, as if, you know, it's in the Russian sort of DNA to be obedient and to submit to some sort of authoritarian system that, you know, was all too easily put in place of the old one after 1917. So I would think that, you know, that should be challenged, and I think we need to think about why that happened in terms of history, in terms of the what-ifs of history, in terms of the turning points of history, and in terms perhaps more broadly of institutions and what institutional factors were at work that to some extent maybe preset the patterns of history, but also what institutions were lacking for democracy or alternative forms of government to the authoritarian systems of rule that Russia and the Soviet Union have had, for those alternatives to develop. Do you understand why I'm wanting to question that supposition in the question, Beryl and Elizabeth?
They're unusually shy today.
Don't be shy, there's only 4 of us here.
Yeah. And plus the whole world of the internet. Because that begs another question as well, which this notion of the Russian tradition, and sometimes some of the questions or some of the reading seems to point to the idea that leaders like Stalin or Lenin were simply acting in the kind of Russian tradition, that, you know, brutal repression, xenophobia are common features across Russian government. How would you feel, or how would you respond to that?
Yes, that's a very common way of thinking about Russian history, isn't it? The idea that there's a sort of line that can be drawn from Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, through to the Bolsheviks and Stalin. And that's part of the Russian national consciousness itself to some extent. You know, the poet Voznesensky, for example, wrote in 1919 about the Bolsheviks, saying that Peter the Great was the first Bolshevik. This idea that the status tradition is everything in Russia, that society is weak, that to get anything done in Russia requires the direct intervention of the state. and that all the Bolsheviks were doing in their utopian projects was repeating the sort of statist methods that Peter the Great had used to build St. Petersburg, that you just use the machinery of the state, that you mobilize masses of slaves or conscripts or soldiers to get the tasks of state construction done. And so this is a way of thinking about Russia which is to some extent adopted by the Russians themselves. But I think that line that can be drawn, needs to be understood properly in its context, because societies can change their political destiny. Societies can make their own history, and Russia doesn't only have a long historical tradition of autocracy, it also has a long historical tradition of democratic revolution. It also has moments in its modern history, 1905 and obviously more particularly in 1917, when it could have taken a very different turn, when it could have, I would argue, even have reinvented the idea of democracy in the West with a different type of Soviet democracy to the parliamentary democracy that had been inherited by Europe and emulated by the Russians since the French Revolution itself. So, in looking at continuity, I suggest we must never lose sight of the possibility of change. David, do you want to come back on that, or maybe Beryl or Elizabeth or Mark at this stage would like to ask another question?
I have a question.
Great.
Between this period, what event would you think is a turning point where this authoritarianism could have changed to a different, structure of government or style of leadership? Where do you think that could have changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we could say that in the long or even the medium term, the period between the early 1900s and 1918 are the key ones to be looked at. Russian society was developing new forms of political democracy, demands for liberal reform that united broad sections of society, from the professions to the liberal gentry to educated peasants and workers, and united the political spectrum from the liberal classes represented by the cadets, the constitutional democrats, and united them with workers in the Marxist tradition. And as a result of their united pressure in 1905 and the political concessions made by the Tsar in the October Manifesto that year, I think that opened a new, as Jeffrey Hosking would put it, constitutional experiment in Russian history. A time when it was arguably possible for a coalition of forces to unite society with reformist elements within the bureaucracy and the government itself to steer Russia towards more Western constitutional forms. Now, ultimately, you could argue, as I would, that it was the ideology of Nicholas II, determined as he was to stick to the principles of autocracy he had sworn to uphold in his coronation oath, that undermined that constitutional experiment. But after his abdication in early March 1917, there was, another real opportunity that in many ways built upon that tradition of political democratic movement in Russia that came to the fore in the provisional government and the euphoric hopes of freedom in the spring of 1917, where again Russia could have found a new path. And although by that stage the war had radicalized workers and peasants, and although by that stage the idea of some sort of unity between the masses and the intelligentsia, as seen in 1905, was now no longer probably realistic, nonetheless a more radicalized form of democracy as represented by direct workers' participation in the management of factories, soldiers' committees, village committees, and ultimately the Soviets, which at this stage were organs of direct democratic participation. They weren't Bolshevik organizations in 1917, not until they became Bolshevized from the autumn onwards. Ultimately, this idea of Soviet democracy, or village rule, if you like, across Russia, might have given way to a different type of democratic tradition, one that I think arguably might have been united with the sort of constitutional parliamentarism represented by the Constituent Assembly, and which obviously the Russians took from the Western constitutional tradition. But, you know, the Bolsheviks under Lenin had different plans, and that steered Russia towards more statist, putschist methods of engineering social revolution, not through democratic organization so much as through mass mobilization, militarization, the dragooning of workers and peasants into Red Guard and Red Army militias and so on, and that new, more autocratic trend in the revolutionary movement we know only too full well. So, to come back to your question, Beryl, it's I think, you know, that was a real window of opportunity when a number of what ifs, you know, might have turned out in a turned Russia in a very different direction. What do you make of that, Beryl? It is Beryl, isn't it, who asked the question? Yeah. Over to you.
Mic on.
Yeah, I agree with many of them, because it is like a what-if question, so there is nothing definite, but I can see your points where you're saying that there is an element of democracy coming in at points, such as the provisional government and after Nicholas II's abdication. So, thank you.
Okay, good. Mark, do you want to come in on that? Do you have any questions or observations? You or your mother? Sorry, I don't know your mother's name.
Her name is Tamara.
Tamara.
Do you have it for us? No. Not for the moment.
Yeah.
Right. Back to you. What would you, Beryl or Elizabeth, have anything else they want to ask at this point? I can't hear anybody. David?
Sorry, yeah, I had the mic off.
Oh, right, good. I wonder, David, whether your students, Beryl and Elizabeth, would like to think about how they might actually construct a response to this question you originally asked about, you know, do you agree that Russia simply exchanged one form of authoritarianism for another? I mean, what factors might there be to explain this sort of full circle, if you like, in Russian and Soviet history?
Oh, we're joined by another student now, but
very good.
Oh yeah, suddenly there's a mass invasion into my office, so just give us 1 minute. Come on in, folks. Are we all right with the chair there, Shannon? You're okay there, Tony? Oh, that's right. I don't know whether...
Great. Do you want to introduce yourself, your new students?
You're hiding behind the cupboard. Tony, if you just want to move over a little bit to Jake. Okay, some new introductions then. So this to my right is Shannon.
Great, nice to meet you.
In the corner there next to Elizabeth is Jake.
Jake, I can see you.
Yeah, and Tony is hiding behind the...
Tony, yeah, don't hide, Tony, I can see you. Great. Can I return to that question I asked Beryl and Elizabeth, really? What factors you might think of in terms of explaining this cycle suggested by David's original question? You know, why is it that Or do you agree with the idea that Russia simply replaced one form of authoritarianism with another after 1917? What factors would you actually think about to explain why that cycle took place? Why, or to put it another way, why democracy wasn't able to establish itself?
Maybe ways of dealing with opposition, repression.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth, can you speak louder? I can't hear you.
Maybe ways of dealing with opposition and repression.
Yes, so in other words, the power of those in power, if you like, to mobilize the resources of the state, the means of coercion, the police, the army, the propaganda machinery, to make enemies of anybody who is opposed to their policies. Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah.
Okay, so how would we go about explaining that institutionally? Is it simply that anyone who holds a gun and can mobilize armies will terrorize Russians into silence, or is it something to do with simply the ruthlessness of those who wield power in Russia?
What do you think?
I'm not sure.
Well, again, it's back to maybe I'll come in here. Again, it's back to this idea of Russian character or the Russian tradition. This idea that there was so much opposition, and the only forum for the opposition, because Russia lacked democratic, liberal, parliamentary systems that exist in the West. Therefore, the only way of opposing the government was to pose a threat to it. And maybe that explains why both the Tsarist system and indeed the communist system were so oppressive and tended to be so brutal. That's maybe a point I'd make there.
Yes, I mean, I think I sort of broadly agree with you, but I think that the problem that this stems from is that there's a sort of paradox at work, because on the one hand, the question supposes that there's a sort of, as we put it, cultural DNA in the Russians to make them rather submissive and obedient and passive in relation to the naked coercive element of power. And on the other, there is this revolutionary tradition. So maybe the way you've put it, as a sort of cycle of violence, that the nature of power in Russia automatically lends itself to a coercive struggle. As Lenin would put it, it's not about, and this is what he said about 1917, it's not about the ballot box, it's not about working out the power question through a system of votes and representations and constitutional rights and duties. He said the nature of power is going to be about kto kavo, about who is going to prevail over whom. And that is about the mobilization of violence. So maybe that's a way of thinking about this institutionally and thinking about it culturally in a way that doesn't just sort of resort to stereotypes, the Russians are passive and obedient. Because the history of Russia's revolutionary movement suggests quite the contrary, that there is a very turbulent element in Russian society. Russians don't tend to take things lying down, they fight back against the state. So it's about the ability to mobilize effective means of violence that matters. And if we think about it culturally, I think a very important element in this question, you mentioned, David, the absence of civil institutions, the absence of rule of law. All of that's terribly important to explain this violence, but also this cycle of authoritarianism in Russia. Because before 1917, the nature of power was such that, it was ruled by coercive means. Until 1905, local magistrates had the power to have people flogged for minor crimes and misdemeanors. And many people in Russian society objected to it. They said this flogging system, this system of corporal punishment, is going to not just brutalize the people who are flogged, it's going to brutalize those giving the floggings. And we must find a way of government that doesn't rest on violence. People like Chekhov, the playwright and the doctor, put it like that. So what I'm suggesting to you is that actually the nature of power in Russia before 1917 turns on violence, it turns on coercion, it doesn't rest on laws. People don't have recourse to the courts in the way that people in much of Western Europe did. Peasants were kept in a separate system of court administration under customary law. Within peasant communities, within peasant households, what would be legal disputes were decided by custom. And within households, peasant elders often, flogged their own wives. They often beat their own wives. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that if you think about power at every level, from the state at its very top right down to the peasant household, people were ruled ultimately by coercion. Sure, there were all sorts of ideas of justice which fueled the revolutionary movement, but laws as such, written laws as such, didn't protect everybody equally. So people who saw themselves as disempowered, who didn't have recourse to the courts against oppression or against injustice, they looked to turn the tables on their masters by revolution. And likewise, once you have a very well-organized group of revolutionaries in the Bolsheviks leading a revolutionary movement and being able to organize an army like the Red Army and stir up mass terror through propaganda, they give voice to this idea of turning the tables by mobilizing class hatreds and by embodying the notion of social justice in this retribution, in the idea of turning the tables. As Trotsky put it very crudely, as he was inclined to in his propaganda of 1917, when he said that the Bolsheviks should put the old elites to work through forced conscription, by making them clean out toilets, clean the streets and so on. He said, well, for years our masters made us do these jobs, now we should make them do these jobs. And this idea of retribution, or turning the tables, was, for many people who didn't understand laws, constitutions, or even Marxist ideology as such, this, for them, was the idea of the revolution itself. And so once you think of that in a bigger sense, by which I mean how a mass revolutionary movement like the Bolsheviks can mobilize these violent forces, you can see how, in the absence of constitutions, laws, and parliaments, and a deep-seated sense of civic rights and duties, you can see how, in the absence of all of those, the Bolsheviks might be able to build a dictatorship that has, to some extent, a popular base, but which has, a minimum, a monopoly of power, a monopoly of coercive power. And that, it seems to me, is where you need to look institutionally and culturally for the origins of this new authoritarianism building on the traditions of the old. Okay, I've spoken quite a lot there. Tony, Beryl, Elizabeth, Tamara, Shannon, have you got any ideas on that or any more questions? Perhaps Mark, you have a question from Berlin.
Für mich, es ist alles richtig und
no, I'm sorry.
Jede Wort absolut richtig.
No, we don't have a question at the moment.
I couldn't hear what your mother said, Mark. Do you want to
She said that she actually agrees, and that's what she saw.
Oh, very good. Okay, good. How about you in West London? Any of your students, David, want to come back on that or have another question?
Another question for him on authoritarianism, or how do you account for the, we're talking about how do you account for the persistence of authoritarian ideas in Russia in the 19th and 20th centuries? And we talked about the need to control opposition, the persistence of, the idea of struggle, being a cultural idea in Russia. And anything else that you'd maybe add to that?
I don't know if this is relevant.
Go on.
How much did the West influence that structure?
Okay, do you want to speak up? Yeah, go on.
The microphone is giving us a look back.
Is it? Right, sorry.
Could Beryl ask that question again? With
Okay, go ahead, Beryl.
I was just wondering how much does the West influence Russia's structure of government? Because West is capitalist.
So Western ideas.
Yeah, Western ideas. How much, or did it influence the Russian government at all when they were trying to form, for example, the provisional government? Did they take any ideas on board?
Yeah, that's a great question, Beryl, and you're absolutely right. When the provisional government tried to impose or implant or inculcate in Russia democratic ideas of parliamentarism and constitutionalism, and passed lots of laws giving religious freedoms, giving freedoms to women, equality to women, and all sorts of other laws. These were largely drawn from their idea of Western European traditions. They were drawn from the traditions of 1789 and 1848. They were, and I would say in this sense they were slightly naive, they were trying to implant onto Russian soil the democratic parliamentary traditions of Europe going back to 1789. They thought they could have in Russia a sort of Assemblée Nationale such as had taken root in France from 1789. They thought that these ideas and principles of parliamentary democracy, individual liberties, the rule of law, civic rights and equalities, they thought all of these could be universally applied, and therefore why not applied in Russia? And so perhaps underestimating the nature of Russian expectations in the countryside, in the factories, in the army in 1917, they tried to argue that Western principles should be applied, that the Russians should wait for their social revolution until a constituent assembly could be formed, and at this assembly they believed the power question, the land question, the nationalities issue, all of these basic principles they believed could be resolved through a parliament such as they had been addressed in parliaments in Europe in 1789 and 1848. They look back to those traditions. And in a sense, that's naive, as I said, but you can also give them credit, I think, for believing, well, why shouldn't Russia be a West European state in that sense? Why shouldn't Russia join the world club or world family of democratic states? It was an advanced industrial society by global terms. It was a pretty literate society by global terms. It had every reason to believe that it could become a Western democracy. And they saw the more sort of, if you like, native traditions of revolutionary organization as a little young and immature, as hugely powerful, with a great deal of potential for democratic renewal, but with a tendency to violence and what they call buntarstva, or what they called simply rioting, as a sort of relic of the past that might be reduced, so long as the Russians were given an opportunity to learn those Western political practices, to learn the traditions of debating in parliaments and having votes, having elections, and deciding policies through compromise, through accepting the vote of the majority. And I think, you know, it's easy now to say, oh, well, that was very naive, and in many ways it was. But at the time, it was born of an idealism of the Russian intelligentsia that looked to the West for all its political ideas and ideologies and wanted Russia to be able to assimilate those traditions and believed it had the potential to. Now, you know, why that didn't happen is another question. We've discussed it in other seminars. But I don't think we should rush to the conclusion, which is, I think, implicit in the original question David asked, you know, the invitation to accept that Russia was sort of inevitably destined to replace one autocracy with another. I think we don't need to accept that. I think we can see that 1917 was a huge opportunity for other forms to take place, to develop more democratic forms, and why it didn't was a result of historical contingencies. It was a result of the catastrophe of the offensive of the summer of 1917, the collapse of military authority, the organization of the Bolsheviks in the big cities, and the ruthless brilliance of Lenin in seizing the opportunity of October to carry out his putsch and begin a movement that would take the revolution in a completely different direction. Beryl, what do you make of my response to that?
Yeah, I agree with it. I do. Yeah, I made some notes. So yeah, thank you.
Because can I come back on one or two points there? Because although I accept what you're saying, that Russia looked to Western ideas, liberal ideas, for certainly the liberal opposition there, but hadn't there always been a tension between Westerners and Asiatic, shall we say? This idea of, you know, Russia is different, Russia is a different entity, has therefore a different destiny, if you like. And this had existed way back to Peter the Great, as it existed in Tsarist Russia, and to some extent it exists in communist Russia as well, the divisions between, say, Trotskyite permanent revolution and Stalinist socialism in one country. I mean, that's another sort of Westerner versus Asiatic manifestation, really. I mean, what do you think of that idea?
Yes, that is a very powerful idea, and so people even foresaw that in 1917 itself. You know, I mean, Gorky, in his essays Untimely Thoughts, wrote in 1917 that, you know, what's happening here is Asiatic, that the intelligentsia had all sorts of European hopes and ideals, but actually the reality that the Bolsheviks are mobilizing comes directly from the Russian peasantry, which is, he wanted to say, an Asiatic force. It doesn't recognize any of those Western principles that the intelligentsia, that the provisional government stands for, that the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries might want to represent. What Bolshevism is tapping into is a deeper Asiatic element of violence, of social retribution, of millenarian hopes of social justice that have nothing to do with Western traditions. And that, as you say, does feed through into the traditions of Bolshevism, separating as they do between those like Trotsky, who was very much a European Marxist and who saw the revolution as doomed to fail unless it could incorporate the advanced industrialized Western powers in a permanent revolution to help the Soviet Union. against its capitalist enemies, and those like Stalin, who had never been much in Europe really, apart from the odd Bolshevik conference, who'd spent the war years in Siberia, and who were arguing from the mid-1920s and carrying out in their revolution of the 5-year plans what you could say, I think, was, a much more autarkic vision of the revolution, that the Soviet Union should draw on its own resources, could not trust any foreign power, even, I think for Stalin, even European communists were suspect because they had their own ideas of what the revolution should be, or were too closely allied to socialists in their countries. And this more autarkic form of Stalinist revolution from above, I think you could argue, rests upon a more Asiatic, if you like, more Asiatic political tradition. Oppositionists famously quip that Stalin was simply Genghis Khan with a telephone. This idea that Stalinism and the cult of Stalin's personality represent an Asiatic or sort of Mongol vision of the state, that it's a patrimonial state, that the rulers of the Soviet Union in Stalin's Russia, literally were the state and could mobilize society for the purposes of the state, regardless of what people said about that. And that, sort of idea of using statist methods to build the new society, this sort of social and human engineering that the Stalinist model of autocracy carries out, is very obviously very different from any Marxist tradition in the European mold, and I would say very different from Leninism, in the sense that Lenin's vision of the revolution in the early 1920s, in his last writings, his vision of the net, the new economic policy, was a vision of social construction, was a vision of building socialism by administrative means that would democratize, or maybe democratize isn't the word, but would certainly involve mass-based political organizations, trade unions, cooperatives, above all, the Soviets themselves. And that this would create bigger market economies that would be taxed by the state, and some sort of pluralism might have been possible within that. That's very different. That's a much more European vision of socialist construction, and I would say almost Menshevik in Lenin's last writings, compared with Stalin's vision of building. Essentially, his idea of building socialism is how the pharaohs built the pyramids. You use the power of the state to conscript slaves, to conscript a slave population. The Gulag is integral to Stalin's vision of building socialism, of building an industrialized economy. And that, has very little tradition in any European absolutist state, other than arguably Peter the Great's vision of the Russian absolutist state. So your question, David, I think is absolutely right, that feeding through from before 1917 into the political traditions of Soviet autocracy or the Soviet system itself, there are these two lineages, and we need to understand why if you like, as you put it, more Asiatic form of absolutism in the Soviet Union prevailed over the more European form. Does that, David, answer the question you think you posed? Or
yes, very well indeed. Very well indeed. There's another idea though as well, which is popular in terms of A-level study. Anyway, this the extent to which Stalin was the heir of Lenin. Was it Alec? No, wasn't it? Stalin is not the executor of Lenin's will, but the executioner of his comrades. Or is there a sense that Stalin was simply carrying on a lot of the seed work that had been done by Lenin in establishing a totalitarian style of dictatorship? I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly think that Stalin built on Leninism. He justified all his policies by the idea that it was fulfilling Lenin's revolution. And in terms of all the institutions of the Stalinist state, they are created and established and consolidated by Lenin and by the Bolsheviks under Lenin. I have no doubts about that. But on the other hand, there are some fundamental divides between Leninism and Stalinism. I don't think Lenin would ever have agreed to any form of collectivization that was as forcible or murderous or disastrous as the collectivization carried out by Stalin. Lenin made the basis of his policy under the new economic policy, the Smychka, the union between workers and peasants, and the Bolsheviks under Lenin, and indeed right through the 1920s, took it as absolutely an article of faith that collectivization had to be based on voluntary measures. So the state could use fiscal encouragement, it could use agronomic aid, it could tax peasant farmers in a way to encourage them and even, you know, slightly push them into the collectives that developed during the 1920s on a voluntary basis. But the idea of mass and forcible collectivization carried out effectively by an army of Komsomol brigades and party workers and units of the army itself to dragoon peasants into mass, large-scale collectives in which they lost all their property, in which the farms were run not by the most able peasants who were, let's face it, the kulaks, but by collective farm managers who mostly knew nothing about agriculture. I mean, this was a disastrous policy, but it was a policy that Lenin would never have agreed to, I don't believe. So that's one aspect of major discontinuity we need to explain. And how does one explain that? I think we go back to the issues we were talking about before, the lack of institutional structures, the lack of voices of dissent, the way the power of the party worked to crush any questioning of party policy, which I suppose goes way back into the revolutionary underground, and the way that Lenin had run the party as a sort of military organization in which, you know, the lower ranks just carried out the orders of the upper ranks and everyone accepted the party line as dictated by the party congress, meaning the party leaders. So, you know, all of that is an element in what enabled this Stalinist form of autocracy to develop. But I think you could also explain it, David, in terms of, you know, what is Stalinism? Does Stalinism build only on Leninism, or does Stalinism take something from the political traditions of Russia before 1917? Does it take something from this more Asiatic tradition in Russian politics and in the polity, which, you know, does go back to the after effects of the Mongol invasion? I mean, I think I would agree with the idea that Stalin is Genghis Khan with the telephone. I think it is a patrimonial state that Stalin is imposing on the Soviet Union. And I think that whereas under Lenin, ideology, policy could be debated within the party, not within society, but certainly within the party, and there was real struggle over policies in which sometimes Lenin found himself in a minority. Under Stalin, you know, it's a pyramid structure that's imposed, and it's all about accepting orders from above. It's all about showing obedience to the party line, and in exchange for that, one gets one's rewards, one gets one's place in the pecking order. And And so this is a sort of patrimonial state structure that Stalin is imposing. And in return for the stability of cadres, the general line of the party, which means the general line of Stalin, is imposed. And this is something that you could explain in any number of ways. You could go back deep into Russian history for the political lineages of this. You could think of it in terms of the patrimonial state. You could think of it in terms of the way, if you like, even the nobility worked in relation to the Tsar before 1917. The Bolsheviks, the functionaries under Stalin held a position in the political order in a way that, if you like, the civil servants, the military servants of the Russian aristocracy held under the Tsar, but with much less freedom, much less ability to question policies, much less liberty in any sense. But where all of these elements of the Stalinist state come from, is something that occupies historians and will occupy historians for many, many years to come. Some of it comes from Lenin, but some of it does, I think, come from the Russian political tradition. David, any of you want to come back on that or ask another question? We have
well, yes. I mean, because one thing I maybe would say there is that I think Lenin was in a very different position as head of government in 1921 at the end of the Civil War than what he was in October 1917. And he had shown those dictatorial tendencies, certainly, both in terms of controlling the party, because he purged the party, hadn't he, in 1921. There was the ban on factionalism, but also, he'd shown a ruthless element as well, the suppression of the Kronstadt revolt. But also, there was a sense that maybe that famine was used during the war communism period as a means of perhaps keeping the peasantry under control. And there's an element of that in Stalin's so-called man-made famine in the early 1930s as well. So I don't know, in a sense that I would say that Stalin does show some tendency to be the heir of Lenin, whilst at the same time recognizing that they are two very different leaders in two different contexts.
Yes, I think what you say is very important, actually, and it suggests two things to me. Firstly, how quickly these authoritarian practices, the willingness of the Bolsheviks to use mass terror, the institutions of the dictatorship as we are to know it under Stalin, how quickly all of these elements come into play during the Civil War. And so how important actually the Civil War is for the formation of the Soviet political system. And the other thing that I think it really suggests, you've touched on it, when you said that the Bolsheviks used, or arguably, were accused anyway, of using famine for political purposes. This, I think, touches on the nature of power in the Soviet system, and arguably, maybe the nature of power still in Russia today. Power is not how we understand power. Power is something that is almost exclusively in the hands of the powerful. It's not something that is up for contestation or for negotiation or for modification by politics in our Western understanding. When the Kronstadt sailors tried to redefine the revolution, redefine the power question, to say we don't want power in the form of a dictatorship, we want power in our understanding of Soviet democracy, in our understanding of Soviet power. When they try to do that, what happens? The Bolsheviks send out the army, volunteers from the 10th Party Congress, and they storm the ice across to the fortress island and mow them down. Thousands are killed. The rest are, where possible, executed after being marched through Petrograd. So this says a lot about the nature of power, and we see it right through Soviet history. The willingness of the state, both in peace and in war, to expend human life. You know, whether it's fighting for Berlin in 1944-5 and simply, you know, pushing forward at whatever human cost, whether it's building the Bielamor Canal in the early 1930s, you know, at whatever human cost. This is a sense of power which I think is very, almost unique really to Soviet Russia, and I think we're still seeing the legacies of it in Russia today. We're still seeing it, you know, in Putinism. We're seeing it in, you know, this cynical campaign by the Putin regime to, you know, launch a war and then lie about it, denying it, to carry out political assassinations, maybe through proxies, or maybe to benefit them and not carry them out themselves. But it's a cynical attitude in itself. I think we're seeing it in, you know, so many aspects of Putinism where power is, you know, who has power in Russia today? People don't have power. They have a vote, but it's not a power in the sense that we have power in our vote, because elections in Russia don't really mean very much. The state has control of mass media. It's you know, often being accused of rigging elections. The referendum in the Crimea after the annexation of Crimea by Russia is, you know, a very good example of a referendum Russian style, if you like. But what it suggests is that these institutions of democracy, even when the state claims itself to be a democracy and wants the West to recognize it as they aren't democratic. So this, you know, brings into relief many of the things we've been discussing today in terms of institutions, in terms of cultural traditions and political practice in Russia. You know, why is it that Putin can get away with what he does in Russia? Why is it that so many Russians believe the propaganda they see on television and vote approval for Putin? Does that make the Russians stupid? Does it make the Russians naive? Does it make them obedient, passive, inclined to passivity in their sort of cultural DNA? No, I don't think it means any of those things. I think it means that we need to explain this authoritarian tradition and its continuation today in terms of history, in terms of institutional infrastructures, in terms of people's memory. If people are disinclined to speak out against Putinism, against the war in Ukraine, against, you know, the rigging of elections, against the massive corruption that exists in Putin's regime, it's because they have a historical memory. It's because, whether directly or through the collective memory of the Soviet period, they know what it means to step out of line. You know, the murder of Boris Nemtsov is like the Kremlin putting out a red light from, you know, its bastions, and the population sees that red light, and it's not necessarily terrified by it, but it receives that signal and knows what it means, and it knows that it means it cannot, you know, this is not a moment to question authority. Yes, not that many people, but 10,000 or so will come out on the streets of Moscow to protest. But most people will just go back to the tired old habits that their fathers and mothers and grandparents had under the Soviet system of, you keep your head down, you don't question things. You don't even ask the questions that you perhaps should, because you know it will lead you into a place which will be uncomfortable and which may get you into trouble. So, you know, this is about history. It doesn't mean that the Russians are, you know, inevitably inclined to accept authority. It means that the history of Russia has locked that country into a sort of cycle of authoritarianism. And it's difficult to escape that cycle once power is in the hands of the few.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been excellent, your analysis today. Unfortunately, we have to go because we're at the turnover of lessons, and
Of course you are.
myself, I have to go and judge a Harry Potter competition, believe it or not. So from one intellectual extreme to another. But anyway, but thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. Thank you, all your students there in West London. Tony Beryl, Elizabeth, Tamara, Shannon, everybody, and thank you, Mark. In Berlin.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.